Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good. Okay, so normally today would have been overdue Doctor Who, except this friggin' Spider-Man thing happened, and if I wasn't gonna bump that to later, then I was gonna have to wait till Friday on this, and I didn't want to wait that long, so here we go. The overdue Doctor Who's still happening this week. It's gonna be on Friday, then it goes back to Wednesday, assuming nothing else friggin' blows up on me. So, Spider-Man looks like he's not going to be in the MCU anymore. Now, I say looks like because the first thing I want to say at the front end of this is that it comes very close to failing to clear the hurdle for what I consider rumors that I try not to talk about. Which is that there isn't really a whole big official, this is why this happened statement from either of these studios that come out. And I tend to wait for that because we live in an age right now where these things happen and they get reported right off the bat. And sometimes that means that stuff gets reported that's just, there's nothing behind it. But other times, things get reported that, yes, it's accurate at the time, but it's just a cog in a bigger picture. That's a big part of why I don't ever do videos about who's in talks for a role, not until they're signed, because everyone seems to have forgotten. I remember when everybody was dead certain that Joaquin Phoenix was going to be Doctor Strange. And you know what? He wasn't. He was in talks, but it didn't close. And it is distinctly possible that what happened between Sony and Disney is just a point in the negotiations when they both walked away. Maybe they'll both take a breather, come back, find a middle ground. Maybe this thing gets restored. That is distinctly possible. So keep that in mind. I'm still going to report on the situation as it exists right now, or at least at the time I'm recording it. This will go up the next day. Hopefully nothing massively has changed since then. So let's recap what even happened. So, the way Spider-Man, Tom Holland's Spider-Man, who has now appeared in Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Infinity War, Endgame, and Spider-Man Far From Home, he is both in these films produced by Sony, but also appearing in the Marvel films like Captain America Civil War and the Avengers films. And the way that is able to happen is Sony and Marvel have reached a shared agreement. Now, the character of Spider-Man, overall, broadly speaking, is still owned by Marvel as a character, as a merchandisable thing, etc. However, the movie rights, the rights to make films, those currently reside with Sony. That's dating way back to before Marvel even started producing its own movies and well before Disney bought them. So Sony has the rights to make Spider-Man movies, and they had been for a while, but they really just ran into a wall when it came to The Amazing Spider-Man. The first one was decently received. The second one did not do nearly as well as they thought it would. And at that point, they struck a deal with Marvel to bring them in and do something jointly. Now, the specifics of the deal as it existed have come out a little bit over time, and here is the deal as it existed at the time. So, because I have to cover what it was, what they tried to negotiate, what each side wanted, why they couldn't meet an agreement, and then I will talk about what does this mean going forward. So I got a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm probably going to talk really fast going through this. So, what Sony got out of that deal was Sony got Marvel to come in and take creative control. Because Sony basically threw up their hands and said, look, we're not going to sell this back to you because it's too dang valuable, but we are screwing it up. Please help us. Now, Disney, even if they weren't going to gain the character back, when I say Disney, Marvel, same thing at this point, going forward in this video. So, Disney had an incentive to actually help them even if they didn't get the character back. Because, as I said, outside of the movies, the character largely, primarily, and fundamentally resides with Marvel and Disney. If Sony ever stops making these things for long enough, there are clauses that will revert it back. So if Sony, and it was getting to a point where if Sony was going to keep spending money on these Spider-Man movies, they were going to start losing money. And it was almost getting to the point where maybe it would have been better for them just to sell it back, but they didn't want to do that. But as I said, there is an interest for Disney and Marvel to help Sony out even if they don't get the character back, because it's important that the IP not get diminished, that the brand not go down in value because the folks who you license the movie rights to are running it into the ground. That's not good for anybody. So Sony got to bring in people who knew how to do the characters and were having a lot better luck with superhero movies than Sony was to help right the ship. And it was in Disney and Marvel's interest to have that ship be righted because Spider-Man is arguably Marvel's single biggest IP. Now, as far as financial compensation, Disney actually got very little. All Disney got was 5% off of what's called the first dollar gross. What that means is Disney took home 5% of the box office takes, not after profits, just straight up. Whatever the box office was, Disney got 5%. And now that's not really a lot when you take into account that Disney was not taking any part of the ancillaries, the back end, and they had absolutely no part in any of the Spider-Man spin-off stuff, which so far has only amounted to Venom, but there's a ton of stuff that Sony's working on and has in the past wanted to make into individual movies, and Disney had absolutely no part in that. So that original deal was actually, honestly, a really sweet deal for Sony because they got somebody to rehabilitate the brand and they reaped the vast majority of the rewards for that. Now, the other thing Disney got out of that deal was they got to use Spider-Man, Peter Parker, Tom Holland in their own films, in Civil War and Infinity War and Endgame, whereas before that would not have been possible. And also as a result of that, in Homecoming and Far From Home, there got to be MCU stuff there, like Tony Stark and Nick Fury and so on. So that exchange kind of worked both ways into everybody's benefit. But honestly, that original deal, sweet deal for Sony. Disney, I don't want to go so far as to say that we're doing a favor. I don't want to attribute that much, sort of altruism to a big mega corporation. It was very calculated, but there was a reason they were willing to extend that. And it would have been pretty naive and wishful thinking on Sony's part to think that they were going to be able to keep that exact same deal. But that appears to be what they wanted, sitting down to the negotiating table to extend the deal out for more films and more projects. So basically what it sounds like is Sony wanted the same deal they already had. They just wanted to add more years onto it. Disney, they wanted a bit more. Now I'm going to throw some numbers out that are going to make a lot of people just shout, greedy Disney ruined everything. But stick with me, there's a little bit of nuance to this. Now, what Disney apparently wanted was they wanted 50%. Now that sounds like a huge jump. That's 10 times more than they were getting before. But it wasn't just 50% of the profits. They actually wanted to do a co-financing deal, which means they were also going to shoulder 50% of the cost. Whereas before, Sony was doing all of the production cost. Disney was handling the creative end, but Sony had control of the pocketbook. They had the power of the purse, which is why they were also reaping the vast majority of the financial rewards, because they were ultimately taking more of a risk from a strictly financial point of view. Now, Disney wanted to say, hey, look, we'll split the cost 50-50 and we'll retain the creative control, but that also means that we are going to take 50% of the profits on this. Now, honestly, I don't think that's what broke the agreement. If I were to guess, what might have broken it, what might have made Sony go, oh no, was that it seems like Disney didn't just want 50% of the main Spider-Man franchise, meaning the Tom Holland-led films. They wanted in on creative control and also 50% split on the spin-offs as well, which again, so far has only resulted in Venom, but there's a lot more in the works. And I can absolutely see why Sony would not want to give them that, because from their perspective, Venom worked and was really successful on the budget that it had. Now, you can debate over how good or not good you thought that movie was, but it did well for them, and they did that completely on their own. It didn't have to share anything and developed it in-house. So the idea that Disney is basically going, oh, those other things you're kind of doing on your own, we'd like in on that too. Now, I'm sure Disney would have had plans to integrate all this stuff more, because since Sony did Venom completely on its own, that's why Tom Holland's Spider-Man wasn't in it. It wasn't part of the deal, so it had to be completely separate. But now Sony basically has proof of concept that it is possible to have a successful ancillary Spider-Man film in which Spider-Man himself does not appear in any way, shape, or form. Now, there have been initial reports where that both sides just drew a hard line on what they wanted, and that was it. Reports are coming in now, or at least statements from Tom Rothman, who's the current head over at Sony, and that's worth pointing out. The guy at the head of Sony right now is not the same person who was at the head of Sony when that original deal was struck. So we are kind of dealing with people who aren't just going like, oh yeah, same things before. Like, no, there's new guys, new rules. So Tom Rothman has said that he was prepared to give a little bit more, but that that Disney was not willing to budge at all from their position. So according to him, and again, that's only one side of it, at the time of recording, the Disney side has not issued a statement about whether or not they were willing to bend at all. But Tom Rothman is saying that they were willing to meet halfway, but Disney was not. And that means everybody just walked away from the table. Now, here's the thing. Everyone's just kind of losing their mind and going, oh my God, it's the end of everything. It's awful. Everybody take a breath. Calm down. I don't think it's as bad as everybody seems to now believe it is. And there's a couple of things I want you to keep in mind as far as keeping all this in perspective. Now, first of all, I'm not happy about this. I would prefer that this deal was still in place. But when I actually think about it and what this means, I'm not that worked up. I'm a little sad, but I'm not that worked up. Because it's not so much as this amazing thing is now broken. It's more of a case of, boy, it's impressive we got to have that at all. I'm kind of surprised it lasted this long. Because honestly, this deal was really unique and made under very specific circumstances that probably wouldn't have replicated again. And obviously don't exist now because Disney was in a position where it was like, no, you can't have the same deal again. The circumstances are completely different. So I'm not shocked that they weren't able to come to an agreement. And honestly, if you stop and think about it, if there is going to be a divergence between the Sony Spider-Man produced films and the MCU, this is probably the best point to do it at, because like Endgame was a big finish for pretty much that entire phase of Marvel. It really left nothing blatantly set up for what would be the next step, including for Spider-Man. So as far as his role in the greater MCU films, if you leave it at Endgame, it feels, not like there was nothing more to be told, but it feels pretty complete. It's not like, oh, we're missing his story. And when you look at the way that the MCU had been woven into Homecoming and Far From Home, yes, we are going to lose that, but I also feel like where things had gotten to by the end of the second film, by the end of Far From Home, I'm not sure they need the Marvel connections anymore. Obviously, Iron Man isn't part of the picture anymore, and while Nick Fury was fun, the movie by no means was a make or break on that. And that little franchise there, that Tom Holland-led Spider-Man films, those have built up enough of their own thing going on, it doesn't really need the MCU connections anymore. It's also worth pointing out that the director of those films, while not yet locked down, is currently in negotiations for at least one, if not two more. And I do think, as far as that primary franchise goes, that the groundwork that they're on at this point is solid enough, and coupled with the fact that Sony is not headed by the same people who completely botched Amazing Spider-Man, that puts me in a position where I'm prepared to go, okay, if they can retain the director, and even though they lose Kevin Feige, if they can retain the director and some of the other creative people, I think there's a very good chance that they can deliver at the very least a third film going on from this that lends itself to just building off of what came before and still working and not suddenly falling apart, provided Sony doesn't do what it has done historically with Spider-Man, which is to force the insertion of all the stuff that will lead to spin-offs. And again, I'm not as doom and gloom about that as I might have been a few years ago, because the people heading Sony were not the same people who were doing that over and over and over again. Not to say the new people heading Sony are perfect, they're making mistakes too, just look at what happened with Men in Black International, but they don't have the tainted history with this specific franchise. And that, for me, is a reason for not necessarily optimism, but just not doom and gloom over it. And I know some people have also said, oh, well, I mean, Sony also did Into the Spider-Verse, and that's like the best Spider-Man movie ever. And yes, it is. But I'm not prepared to give them a super ton of credit on the basis of that, simply because, well, Lord and Miller headed that. And it's hard to know how much credit to give to Lord and Miller. I mean, they didn't direct it, but they were the minds behind it. And I've said repeatedly, Lord and Miller's entire thing is figuring out how to take ideas that should never work and figuring out how to make them work, even on films that they have not directed. Lego Movie 2 was great. They didn't direct it. Lego Batman was great. They didn't direct it. Into the Spider-Man-verse was great. They didn't direct it. But they were deeply involved in figuring out the story and the angle and the way to approach all of these movies. So I don't necessarily look at Into the Spider-Verse and go, oh, that means that they'll be able to just do that well with the main Spider-Man. Like, no, we're looking at completely different creative teams heading up these situations. So that doesn't impact my view either way. I think the main thing we need to watch out for at this point, assuming that, both sides don't come back to the table and just work this thing out, but if that doesn't happen, then it's basically just a matter of time before Sony integrates Spider-Man with all the spin-off stuff they were working on, which, as a reminder, is a sequel to Venom, which now has a director in Andy Serkis. They are working on a Morbius movie. They are working on a Kraven movie. I think the Silver Sable and Black Cat movie fell apart, but that was on the docket at one point. Like, there's a lot of stuff that they can work on, and none of that had been tied to Spider-Man before because it wasn't part of their shared deal with Marvel. And Marvel didn't want those spin-offs tied in. They didn't want these things that they had no control over to be leeching off the MCU. But with all that in place, I would be surprised if they didn't start integrating that in. The other thing is, though, how much longer they're even going to have Tom Holland. Now, I found slightly mixed things about whether he has 1 or 2 more movies on his contract. What I'd heard before was that he only had 1 movie left on his contract, but in some of the things, it looks like he may have negotiated at this point for a 4th, or maybe it was on there and we didn't know about it. It's not entirely clear. But unless he re-ups his contract, which that's a whole separate set of negotiations, but unless he does that, they get at least 1, maybe 2 movies out of him. And so, in my mind, that's the big worry is, if they think they're going to lose Tom Holland after a couple more movies, I'm worried that there is going to be an instinct, and not just because it's Sony, just because that's the studio mentality, to milk everything they can possibly get out of those times. And as long as they can resist the urge to do that, I think they're on solid enough footing. So, like I said, I'm not happy about this. I'm not thrilled about it. But from a business standpoint, I get it. I totally get why Sony would walk away from this and say, no, we think we're on solid enough ground that we can take it from here. And I also don't automatically think that they're going to screw it up, which some people seem to be assuming at this point. Again, different people heading the studios and planning the direction for things overall than there were at the time that Spider-Man 3 happened or both Amazing Spider-Man movies happened. So, again, that's not so far as to say benefit of the doubt. I'm sure it'll be fine. No, I don't know that. But I'm also not automatically going, oh, it's doomed and ruined. No, I think enough of the groundwork that Kevin Feige and his team put in to help right this ship is there that we're going to get at least 1 more good movie out of this before it all goes completely pear-shaped. And potentially, maybe even keep working after that. Because maybe Inside the Spider-Verse isn't a fluke. Maybe it's not just down to Lord and Miller. I don't necessarily have the faith that that's the case, but it's a possibility. And I'm, again, not happy. It's not good news, but it's not the disaster a lot of people are saying. At least not to my eyes, not how I see it. How much you want to bet that a lot of what I said has now been negated, corrected, or whatever between when I shoot this and when I edit it and put it up? We'll find out. Your thoughts on Spider-Man no longer being part of the MCU or whatever new news is broken on it since I shot this darn thing. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. A whole bunch of stuff to do down there. Like, subscribe, really big help. If you want to support me on this channel and help make it better, there's the Patreon. That also helps me cover my bills. It's a huge help. And there is other stuff down there, my socials, link to a book I wrote, all that sort of stuff. Check it out down below. Click on links. They'll take you places, or don't. I don't know what happened to my voice, but at the end of the day, you're the council and I'm just running the meetings. Until next time, I don't know what that was. This council's adjourned. Punch drunk.